In 2022, the UK sent 2 aircraft carriers to the Indo-Pacific for an 8-month global tour of unaliving people. But sometimes, even NATO has to admit that it's got nothing on the French. 1355, the year that England's King Edward the Black Prince's balls turned to ash in his mouth, and he shat his royal pants. It all started earlier in the year when the French king, King the Good, went to London to meet with Edward III and hammer out some sort of treaty to end the 100 Years' War. But upon arriving in London, John found that Edward was unreally interested in hammering out any treaties. He just knew that Jean was in cahoots with this guy who owed him money, and it pissed him right off, and spent most of their time together getting drunk, playing backgammon, and trying to kill each other's ambassadors. So John decided to just go home and get on with things. So Edward handed command over to his half-brother Edmund of Woodstock, while he himself went back to London to tend to his favourite hobby, making legitimate heirs, because, believe it or not, there was a time before Desch when France was actually doing all the She had heard rumours that Edward was planning on killing John and his nobles, and she didn't want the same thing to happen to her. However, the relief force that Charles V had sent was actually under the command of Sir John de Dorset, a famous medieval knight whose job it was to escort her to safety, but unfortunately, he was killed in a skirmish with English forces led by none other than William Montague, the Earl of Salisbury, and then Edward dropped the charade and ordered both bishops executed. Now, without the element of surprise, Charles V wasn't about to accept any treaty that threatened English domination of Aquitaine, so he dug his heels in and waited for reinforcements. In the meantime, he did manage to lay siege to the nearby town of Sens, which fell after a couple weeks. His name was Bertrand du Guesclin, and he would go on to become one of the greatest military commanders in French history. But then du Guesclin did something no one thought possible. Meanwhile, the Black Prince, having seen enough bloodshed and devastation in his life to last a lifetime, popped the cork on a bottle of vintage claret and retired to Westminster Abbey to live out the rest of his days as a monk. He chased after them and beat them at the Battle of Coquerel in January 1358. But at this time, he was just a simple captain who'd gotten lost. But then he had to come back to Poitiers to deal with a supply shortage, and that is why the Black Prince is best known for his legendary balls of ash and pants of terror. So now it's November 1357, and the English have been Poitiers for almost a year with no end in sight. This was a problem because winter was coming and the supply lines to Poitiers were stretched thin. So it basically amounted to nothing. The English would lift the siege of Poitiers, and Charles would pay them 4 million livres, release all English prisoners, and renounce all claims on Aquitaine, in exchange for something called the Treaty of Brie. The treaty stipulated that Edward would retain possession of all land he had acquired during the war, including the counties of Ponthieu and Maine and a big chunk of Normandy, as well as Aquitaine and Gascony. Basically, it was everything that Edward had conquered during the 100 Years' War, except for Paris and a few other territories. And we're going to tell you all about it today. Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we'll be discussing the Black Prince's nightmare raid. But then Edward said, whoa, hold up. You can't just leave without paying your bar tab. And also, my ambassadors are dead. And I need to find someone to hang for that, because while Edward was fond of having a good time, he was even fonder of having a good lineage. And in total, he made 14 of them, 13 of which were boys. One of these boys, born in 1338, would become Henry V, but all the others died before they ever saw double digits, and that meant that Edward needed to keep making babies until one of them stuck. So John said, "Okay, fine, but you still owe me 400,000 livres, and I'm taking Normandy with me when I go." and they eventually agreed that John would pay the debt by giving Edward the county of Ponthieu, and then they all rode off into the sunset with a wave and a nod. Well, maybe not exactly like that. Edward actually rode back into England, while John took the long way around through which at this point was more of a chore than anything, because Aquitaine had effectively been a province of France since 1259, and everyone there hated the French as much as they hated Meanwhile, Edward III, once he got back to London, promptly forgot all about the whole treaty thing, and instead set about making a baby. To fund this noble endeavor, Edward turned to taxation, which, if you're picking up what I'm putting down, might have been kind of difficult, considering that he also started a war and then immediately lost all of his money. So, to solve this problem, Edward made a bunch of nobles, including his councillors and even his own wife, pay higher taxes, which they did not like William Montague, the 4th Earl of Salisbury, who after Edward tried to seize his property to make him pay his taxes, replied with a resounding, "Nah, I quit," and ran away from England to France, where he joined John the Good's court as a knight-errant, now unbeknownst to all parties involved. This was the same William Montague, who had been in London trying to negotiate the treaty with Jean, but Edward didn't know that. Now, despite his advanced age and fondness for both wine and cake, Edward was still a capable military commander, which is how he managed to catch John and his men by surprise, completely wrecking them at the Battle of Poitiers in September 1356. And then afterward, he actually showed some restraint and didn't kill John, only to take him and most of his nobility hostage back to England and demand that France pay a massive ransom in exchange for their freedom. Again, everyone was pretty surprised by this turn of events. No one expected England to win, least of all England, and now they had the French king in their They should have just ended the war right then and there. But Edward didn't want to do that. Not only did he want his pound of flesh, he wanted a whole roasted boar full of plum pudding, and as such, he decided to send a letter to John's wife, Queen Isabella of Luxembourg, demanding that she send him the 300,000-strong Anglo-French force that was supposed to be protecting Instead, she sent her husband's brother, King Charles V, who, with the help of the French constable, the Dauphin's father, was able to raise a relief force of over 25,000 men and march them to Poitiers, where they promptly laid siege to the city. Now, it's important to mention here that neither Edward nor his son John, who was now nominally the Prince of Wales, were very good at sieges, losing many battles to the Scottish and Irish, respectively. Unfortunately, though, when Edmund got to he found that the place was so well defended that he could undo anything and ended up spending most of his time waiting for reinforcements. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella of Luxembourg was busy hiding in a castle in northern Aquitaine, called Le with her bodyguard dead and Edward looking for excuses to hang her husband's friends. Isabella decided to flee to Paris instead, where she promptly got arrested by Charles V for being a traitor. So Edward III hatched a plan. He would send a pair of bishops named Jocelyn of Salisbury and Simon Langham to Charles V and offer him a new treaty. This treaty would have been great for Edward if Charles had immediately realized that he was getting hustled and refused to sign it. As it turned out, those reinforcements never came. But Charles was actually saved by a single man who accidentally stumbled into Poitiers in the middle of the night. When the English saw him enter the city, they assumed he was part of a relief force and fled, which allowed Charles to escape and regroup with his army. Following this victory, Duguesclin became Charles's marshal, and together they marched into Paris, where Charles was crowned the next King of France. Edward III died 5 years later in 1377, leaving the throne to his grandson, Richard II. We hope you enjoyed this episode with a special thanks to our patrons.